play it any louder, then it's getting shut down.
My name's Waffles, and I'm a government whistleblower turned political commentator, and these are the days of Trump's lies. Today is September 18th, 2025. It is 10:42 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Here are the top U.S. news highlights for the past 24 hours. Trump sues major media for defamation. Trump filed a $15 billion defamation/libel suit against the New York Times and Penguin Random House. This is a high-profile, aggressive civil action that will add another major case to the docket. Justice Department sues to block State Climate Superfund law. DOJ filed a motion for summary judgment challenging Vermont's new law that would impose large liabilities on polluters. The federal challenge signals ongoing administration efforts to roll back or block state climate accountability measures. Federal court rulings protecting migrants. Federal judges issued rulings blocking certain deportations of unaccompanied Guatemalan children and preserving temporary protected status for Venezuelans, marking immediate legal limits on recent immigration enforcement moves. Federal and National Guard mobilization. Memphis. The administration has ordered National Guard deployments to Memphis as part of a federal public safety surge. The move has sparked debate and local pushback about the use of military forces for domestic policing. This follows a pattern of federal force mobilizations to select U.S. cities in recent weeks. Targeted threats and prosecutions. Prosecutors charged a Texas man with terroristic threats for death threats against a mayoral candidate in New York, an example of polarizing threats against political figures that remain a significant domestic risk vector. Rhetoric and reported pressure from the administration in public remarks after the high-profile assassination of Charlie Kirk. Donald Trump threatened to target the radical left. What the radical left is or who the radical left is, we don't even know. This is a word that is not clearly defined. It is a term that is being misused as a threat towards the American people, in my opinion. Language. Civil liberties groups and many nonprofit organizations say risks chilling dissent. Congressional Democrats have also raised concerns about... I apologize, I'm doing a good job at smashing on my keyboard the past couple days. Congressional Democrats have also raised concerns about pressure on broadcasters and regulators. Separate oversight letters and ACLU statements document allegations of pressure or threats aimed at media outlets. Federal rollback litigation strategy is active beyond Vermont. The administration is actively litigating to block state laws like the climate liability and other state policy experiments, and is seeking judicial authorization for broader executive actions, including court filings that ask high courts to allow firings and removals of certain officials, e.g. a recent filing seeking permission to remove a Fed governor. These moves expand executive reach and raise institutional governance questions and risks to regulatory protections. So what we are discussing with this one is a legal and political strategy by the federal government, specifically the executive branch, to reduce and counteract policies and regulations at the state level and to expand its own power. So Trump is essentially trying to find ways to regulate how states govern themselves and expand its own power over independent federal agencies. It's a two-pronged approach that uses litigation to achieve its goals. Rollback and litigation against states. This part of strategy involves the federal government, often through the Department of Justice, suing states to block or overturn their laws. The example given is a lawsuit against Vermont for climate liability law. But this is a broader pattern. The federal government argues these state laws are unconstitutional or that they interfere with the federal authority, a legal concept known as preemption, federal rollback. This refers to the federal administration's efforts to dismantle or weaken existing regulations, particularly those related to climate and environmental protection. Imagine that. I can't wonder why they're doing that. I mean, we're only seeing evidence of freaking market manipulation. So, whoever's manipulating the markets right now, do they have the intention of just destroying the environment wherever they go? Because that's what this makes me think. Blocking state laws when states try to fill the regulatory void left by federal rollbacks, e.g. by passing their own climate laws. The federal administration sues them. This is intended to create a uniform, less regulated environment nationwide by preventing states from implementing stricter policies. This is an expansion of executive power. This is the second part of the strategy focused on increasing the president's control over the federal bureaucracy. This highlights that the administration is using court filings to seek judicial permission to fire certain officials, firing for-cause officials. The example of the Federal Reserve governor is key. Agencies like the Federal Reserve, Consumer Protection Safety Commission, and others are designed to be independent of political whims. Their leaders can only be removed for cause, e.g. for incompetence or malfeasance, not for political disagreement. Challenging independence, the administration is challenging these legal protections in court, arguing that the president should have the authority to remove these officials more easily. This raises significant questions about institutional governance and the risks to regulatory protections, as it could weaken the independence of agencies responsible for critical areas like monetary policy, consumer safety, labor relations. If the president can fire an official simply for disagreeing with their policies, it could undermine the very purpose of having an independent agency. Consumer-facing regulatory and enforcement shifts. The administration's pattern of rule rollbacks and high-profile lawsuits and threats to regulatory agencies is creating near-term uncertainty in regulated sectors, being energy, environment, telecoms, that could change compliance costs, consumer protections, and utility regulatory oversight. Lawfare and NGO trackers note dozens of active suits challenging or defending federal actions that directly affect customers and regional services. Puerto Rico governance and utilities risk. 3 members of Puerto Rico's Federal Financial Oversight Board sued the administration after abrupt firings. The dispute could affect debt restructuring and decisions tied to the island's power authority, a potential infrastructure and service delivery risk for residents. Judicial limits on some enforcement TPS decisions to preserve access. Recent court rulings that block some deportations and preserve TPS status have immediate public health and social service implications for migrant communities who rely on continuity of care and work authorization. Separately, the CDC, ACIP calendar and politically charged oversight of public health advisory bodies remains a near-term watch item for political policy shifts affecting vaccines and coverage. International relations, domestic moves with diplomatic ripple effects, federal litigation to overturn state climate accountability laws, and high-profile media litigation and rhetoric are being watched by foreign governments and markets. Actions that affect U.S. regulatory predictability, energy, trade, tech policy can reverberate in trade, investment, and diplomatic talks. And for legal actions against the Trump administration, new suits and filings, DOJ motion challenging Vermont's climate law, lawsuits filed by 3 dismissed members of Puerto Rico's Oversight Board alleging unlawful firings, continued stream of litigation tracked by legal outlets, Lawfare and Just Security, documenting dozens of active suits challenging administrative actions, environmental, immigration, regulatory removals, and federal deployments. Today, the stock markets closed with the Dow Jones at 46,142.42 cents, up 0.3%. The S&P 500 at $6,631.96, up 0.5%. NASDAQ $22,470.73, up 0.9%. And for trade and economic highlights for the past 24 hours, U.S. import dependence on the EU now exceeds that on China for many product groups. A study by Germany's IW Institute found that the U.S. is now importing more in value and number of goods from the EU than from China in many sectors. Examples include chemicals, electric goods, machinery, and equipment. Total value from those EU imports reached $287 billion across 3,100 product groups versus $247 billion from China across 2,925 of these groups. The shift is attributed to U.S. de-risking strategies aimed at reducing over-reliance on China. Supreme Court to hear arguments on Trump's global tariffs. The U.S. Supreme Court has scheduled November 5th to hear cases on the legality of tariffs imposed by Donald Trump under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. A lower court had ordered that Trump exceeded his presidential authority by using IEEPA for sweeping tariff power. The decision could have big implications for U.S. trade policy and executive authority. Tariff revenues considered for aiding U.S. farmers. Agricultural Secretary Brooke Rollins has raised the possibility that revenue from tariffs could be used to fund a bailout for farmers. A bailout that they would not need if it was not for tariffs and unscrupulous executive orders. This comes as some U.S. farm exports, e.g. soybeans, have been hit by trade retaliation or reduced demand, particularly from China. Fed interest rate cut and its spillover effects on borrowing costs. The Federal Reserve lowered its benchmark rate by 25 basis points to 4.00 to 4.25 in its most recent meeting, the first cut since December. Following that, major banks, J.P. Morgan, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, reduced their prime lending rates from 7.5 to 7.25. This affects many consumer business loans. Oil market, little changed. Concerns on demand and inventory. Oil prices were mostly flat today despite the Fed's rate cut. Brent at $67.43 a barrel. When I first started reporting on oil a few months ago, it was like at 63. WTI, 63.53. So the cost of oil has gone up about $4 a barrel from where it was at when I initially started watching. A big factor was an unexpected increase in U.S. distillate inventories, about 4 million barrels versus the expected additional 1 million. So that's an increase of 4 million instead of an increase of 1 million, suggesting cooling demand. U.S.-China and trade tech negotiations advancing. Trump and Xi Jinping are set to discuss a TikTok ownership deal and broader trade/tech issues, which reflects movement in U.S.-China relations amid previous tensions. India/U.S. trade talks are also reported as progressing and on the right track, per the Indian Commerce and Industry Minister Piyush Goyal. And remember, kids, the stock market is not the economy. Just because the S&P 500 or Dow Jones might be performing does not mean that jobs are growing, wages are secure, inflation is under control, or that people are thriving. And here's the upcoming hazardous weather outlook for the next few days. Southwest and Southern California, day 1 to 2. Tropical moisture is moving in, bringing heavy rain and a risk of flash flooding, especially in southern coastal California, parts of Arizona, and the southern Rockies. Already ongoing rainfall may lead to saturated soils and runoff issues. Moisture remains elevated. Flash flood risk begins to diminish somewhat, but still present in localized heavier rain areas. Plains and Mississippi Valley, day 1 to 2. Strong to locally severe thunderstorms expected in portions of the plains and the Mississippi Valley. Threats include damaging winds, hail, and heavy rain. Potential for localized flooding in areas with repeated heavy downpours. Severe risks likely decline, but pockets of thunderstorms are possible, and heavy rainfall may remain possible in about 3 days. So a little bit further down the timeline here. Southeast and Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands, tropical moisture is producing heavy rainfall in southeast Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. This raises risk of flash flooding, especially in areas with steep terrain or poor drainage. Western U.S. interior and southern Rockies, heavy rain likely, especially where tropical moisture overlaps mountainous terrain. Flood and flash flood risk is elevated. Rain threat persists but begins to taper off. Lingering moisture could still produce strong storms or flash flooding in vulnerable spots. Midwest, Northeast, mountain states, north of the Rockies, other regions, minimal risk of severe weather in the next 3 days, according to current outlook. Some isolated thunderstorms possible, but nothing showing up as high risk or widespread or severe at this time. And here are the top international news highlights for the past 24 hours. U.S. casts 6th UN Security Council veto on Gaza resolution. The United States vetoed a draft UN resolution that called for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, and for Israel to lift all aid delivery restrictions. The resolution also demanded release of all hostages held by Hamas. The U.S. was the sole veto all by itself. 14 of 15 council members supported it. UN Commission finds genocide was committed in Gaza. A UN Commission of Inquiry concluded in a report released this week that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. Israel strongly rejected the findings, calling them biased and based on what it claims unverified evidence. Ukraine counteroffensive in the east. Ukrainian forces have launched a counteroffensive on the Eastern Front. President Zelensky reported that Ukrainian troops have reclaimed 7 settlements in Donetsk, asserting that the counteroffensive is preventing Russian forces from mounting a planned large-scale offensive. Macron, UN sanctions on Iran to be reimposed by the end of September. French President Emmanuel Macron said that UN sanctions on Iran will likely be reimposed by late September of 2025. The E3, Britain, France, and Germany initiated a 30-day process in August after finding Iran's responses and talks unproductive. Macron said Iran has not made more serious commitments to restore nuclear inspection, access, or engage in required dialogue. Cuba calls on UN to act against perceived U.S. militarization in the Caribbean. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez has urged the United Nations General Assembly and Security Council to intervene, citing what he characterizes as dangerous U.S. militarization in the region. He criticized U.S. operations like naval interdictions as threats to peace, accusing the U.S. of using counter-drug operations as a cover for broader aggression. UN aid chiefs urge world leaders to step up after U.S. funding cuts. In the lead-up to the UN General Assembly, UN humanitarian officials are calling on world leaders to fill gaps left by sustained attack on the UN's funding. Especially after cuts from the U.S., the aid community warns that delays in restoring funding risk mass suffering and disruptions of life-saving programs. This has been today's news. It is 11:08 p.m. Everybody stay safe out there. We will see you later.